But the thing about the grumbling is that there's a certain good revealed in it, right? Because if you're constantly rejecting God's saving plan, it means that you're constantly hearing it. Like you're struggling with it. They never completely got rid of God's saving plan, and replaced it with their own, right? They never got to the point where their God became like the God of other nations that lived in where they lived in harmony with their gods, right? Other nations, people didn't argue. Nobody argued with Bacchus. People are like, hey, you like to get drunk? Yeah, I like to get drunk. All right, Bacchus, that's God. He's the divine thing. It's a divine power, right? No, people love that, right? People don't argue with the goddesses of fertility. Everybody wanted kids. Everybody wanted crops, right? There's no conflict there. That's just the obvious, right? That's just the basic perceived human self-interest. Yeah, we want food. Yeah, we want drink, right? Yeah, we want nice big families, and we want lots of food to feed them with. Yeah, we want power. Yeah, we want to win wars, right? All these are what their gods were about. Just the obvious human desires, but nothing. There was not a new vision. There was not something that transcended that and looked at a better way of life, right? So the gods were very complacent with oppression and misery. They're very complacent with the status quo in which a few people had power and oppressed the rest. But it's not the Israelite God, right? And so there's going to be conflict because God is going to be presenting us with an alternative to that short-sighted way of life. Right? Like Loafing points this out when he talks about the Israelites that were constantly struggling with God because they were still listening to his will. They were still open to his plan for salvation and not just their own. Right? You wouldn't have conflict if you weren't even paying attention. Right? If they weren't hearing it, they wouldn't argue with it. So it's like he said, Israel certainly sensed the will of God was more beneficial and reasonable than its own will. Right? It's better to follow Yahweh than the other gods. Again, that's why I always say when I talk about the gods of other nations and what they really represent, I say perceived self-interest, right? Because God's way, salvation, this is actually what we want deep down, right? Take us way back to the beginning of the course. Everybody wants contentment, everyone wants happiness. And we think that various things, short-term things, are going to get it for us, right? Power, control, right? Wine, right? We think, oh yeah, this is going to make me happy, but it doesn't work. It's a short-lived experience, and we end up more miserable than we began, right? But God reveals something different. God is talking about a lasting happiness, something that actually works. And he's sharing that vision and challenging the Israelites to live that life. Right? The society of the heavenly Jerusalem. The community that was present in the Garden of Eden before the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's like Loafing said, stubbornness, faithlessness, infidelity can only exist where a people in the course of its history has encountered the true God and God's will. Right? Because it's not just resorting to, the short-sighted, perceived self-interest. We're not just saying, hey, let me grab as much money as I can here, right? The Israelite vision is, how is my livelihood going to affect the whole people? And so again, it's like we saw in Deuteronomy. There's always limits on the consolidation of power. It's not just about me, and it's not just about my tribe. It's not even just about my country, right? It takes a God view, and it cares for everyone. It's universal love. So, what Loafing's talking about is religion, which I think he means a bad use of religion. This is right, attributing one's own perceived self-interest or obvious force of nature to God's will. Right? So in other words, what I want, that's God. Even if maybe what I want isn't actually good for me and others in the long run. And that's the problem with bad use of religion, or religion as he calls it. It doesn't actually save people or societies. It doesn't bring happiness. It doesn't create the eschatological city of New Jerusalem. It doesn't realize our potential that is expressed and symbolized in life in the Garden of Eden, right? But revelation or faith, and again, I think he's talking about a good use of religion here. And I'll explain why. This sees God's actual will, which we know is love one another, right? And it actually can save people. It actually does bring us true happiness. It actually does change societies. It actually does bring about the realization of a new and better way of life. So that's kind of the question I already alluded to for Lofink, is like he talks about religion as projecting the forces of nature and human perceived self-interest onto God. And then he contrasts that to revolution or faith, which is the experience of the actual will of God, right? However, like when he goes to talk about the Israelite experience, that's not what he's talking about it in a different way. He's actually saying in the Israelite experience, like the religious tradition preserves the will of God, right, in a way that challenges people every generation to pick it up and follow it as their own, right, instead of their own perceived self-interest, right? So it confronts them with the possibility of the new way of life so that those who are ready to hear it and live it can choose to join in. But again, that's kind of confusing, I think, the way Lofink is saying it, because if religion, in the case of the Israelites, he's saying that religion is how revelation is passed on and shared. He says this is what the Torah is all about, right? This is what the prophets are telling the kings, right? So if religion is how revelation is passed on, then isn't it more appropriate to talk about good use of religion, bad use of religion, than just using the word religion for the substitution of one's own will and the forces of nature for the will of God, right? And then talking about revelation as some kind of authentic reflection of the will of God, right? So in other words, maybe it'd be better to use the terms good religion, or good use of religion, or bad religion, bad use of religion, instead of just using religion as the negative term and revelation as a positive term. Because you don't know about revelation. Like you don't have faith except for through a religion, right? I mean, that's the way that the faith, that the revelation has been passed on through the people of God in Israel and through the people of God, the church. So I hope that Lofink wouldn't I don't think he'd disagree with it if I'm reading him correctly. And it could just be a matter of translation or something. The terms might be used differently in Germany or something. But I just want to point that out. Like when he's talking about religion, he's obviously not talking about all religion, because he's praising the way that the Israeli religion continued to confront the people with the will of God. And he's a Catholic priest, and he writes about Christianity doing the same thing.